Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a wren in acrylics. Now the tips and techniques that I share in this video can be applied to painting any other bird, and it's all about focusing on three main things. I like to focus on getting good contrast, so my lights and my darks. I want to be focusing on the layering process and the brush technique. Now the very first stage here, once I've painted my background, which is shown in the real-time step-by-step tutorial on Patreon, I like to work with building up a good base foundation on the subject. Now at this base stage, I'm not looking to mix the exact colour. I can change all of that with the use of glazes, but I want to be focusing on the placement of the lights and the darks. Now one thing that's really important is the position of the highlights and shadows aren't random, they follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now something else that's influenced by that is the feather direction. So you can see that I'm always moving my brush following the curve of those feathers, and that's going to help to build up the shape of the face and the body. So here as I curve across to the top of the head, I'm making sure to bend that brush stroke across to the left hand side. When I work under the beak, I'm dragging the brush down but slightly curving towards the right corner. Now this, in combination with the contrast, is something that's going to help bring lots more of that three-dimensional look to the painting. Now glazes is something that I use in all of my paintings, and it is something that can add not just depth but can remove that stress of worrying about mixing the exact colour. I've got a video here on YouTube and it's all about the glazing process, how I use them, and I've got various examples of different paintings for different scenarios on where glazes can be used. So if that's of interest, I'll link that video in the description below. Now once I've built up a good base foundation, the next stage is to start mapping in the basic details. Now this is not the brightest highlights, I want to save those for my later layers. But here you can see I'm just getting some kind of texture in place to replicate that initial base foundation of feathers. Now the one thing that the real-time step-by-step tutorial on Patreon focuses on is how to move that brush in a way to replicate the right type of feather. So the feathers on a wren, a robin, any birds like that are going to be different in how they're structured compared to maybe an owl or an eagle. So it's what I wanted to be focusing on to make sure that the brush technique was a main priority. Now one thing that will influence that is how much paint we load onto the brush and how thin that mixture is. So you can see here that I've just applied a glaze where I've adjusted the colour. Now when working with glazes, the mixture needs to be significantly thinner than when we work with adding details. So you can see here the mixture, it's significantly lighter and therefore more opaque. Now an opaque colour just means that you can't see through it. A transparent colour would be something that you would use for a glaze, because the glaze is there to just tint that layer. You still want to be able to see all of the details underneath. Now I like to work in small sections and break it up into those individual layers. So once I built up this foundation of feather texture, I can now come in with a smaller liner brush and hint at more of those delicate feathers that are sitting on the very top. Now however, when you work with a liner brush, there is a potential that those brush strokes can be too harsh. So what I didn't want here is for the feathers to start looking like fur and end up looking wiry. So you'll see that at times I'm using a small makeup brush to actually soften the edges of the liner brush details. Now it is very important to make sure that you don't overuse that brush, because you can end up over blending. Now overblending can happen very easily with mediums like this, and it's something to be aware of. You still want to have definition within your layers, but you also don't want them to look too harsh. Now blending acrylics is a question that I'm asked all the time, and it's one of the things that I like to focus those real-time tutorials on Patreon. Being able to blend acrylics so that you get an effect similar to oils, like the background that I've got here, all that was done with traditional brushwork, and it can be done, but the right layering process and technique needs to be used. Now regarding blending, this is something that I get asked frequently about because of how fast acrylics dry. Blending can be quite challenging. However, if we use the right techniques, it's something where you can actually create very soft blended transitions similar to oils and create a really nice soft effect. Now as I start to build this base layer here, you'll notice that it's very soft. I don't like to focus on details first or too early on. I want to get a nice base foundation in initially. There are no harsh start and stop points, and once I've got that softness in place and the layer is completely dry, I can then start working and focusing on the details. Now this is a prime example. This first layer, it doesn't look great. You can still see some of the green background, but what I need to do is dry it, which I've done here, and then do a second layer. If you've got any section of your background showing through, you ideally want to work with another base layer to cover that up, so you've got a nice smooth transition, smooth layer like what I've got here. This is a really nice base to then start adding in your details. I personally feel that if the details are added when the base layer is sort of more rigid looking, more of those harsh start and stop points, then it makes the details also look really rigid as well. So you're going to end up with potentially a painting that's more two-dimensional and flatter in appearance. Now I do just feel that if I've got a nice well blended base layer, that my details that I apply on top naturally start to look a little softer, and for the most part that's what we want for those base layers, whether or not it's fur or feathers that we're painting. So this area here on the front of the chest, this is a prime example. Here I'm going to be building up a hint of that texture, so I'm really following the feather direction, how thick those feathers should be, which is based on how much pressure I'm applying to the brush, how long those feathers should be based on how long that brush is in contact with the canvas for. But this is helping to provide that initial soft layer. But these brush strokes would not look as soft as this if I didn't have my base layer looking blended initially. So I think these two processes here, they really do go hand in hand. Now of course this is potentially going to vary to some degree depending on the animal that we're painting. The way that we move the brush is going to have to be adjusted accordingly because the textures from one bird to the next is going to be quite different. But the main fundamental process and the principles there are the same. Working with building up those layers gradually, always looking to refine those layers as we go. So each layer that I'm starting to add here gets a little lighter. And then when I've got the right amount of depth for that stage, I'm using a glaze here to adjust the colour. I'll wait for that to dry and then I can start building up my layers again. So this layer of paint is slightly lighter, but I'm always looking to reinforce the way that the feathers are built up, the direction, the thickness and the length. Now something that's really important with any painting, any drawing, doesn't matter the medium, is the lighting. So with this bird there was a strong one-sided light source, there was a very bright highlight down the right side of the body. So as I continue to now add my layers, you'll see that I'm starting to then build up more of that lighting on the right hand side. Now having a strong one-sided light source can make for a really eye-catching painting. It can really bring attention to that more so than a painting that's more detailed. You can have loads of detail there, but if the lighting's not right, the painting will appear very flat. But just like what I've mentioned throughout this video so far, it's all about that layering process. I haven't jumped to using titanium white, my brightest paint. I instead am building up my layers gradually. Each layer that I'm adding, I'll add a little bit more of my titanium white to the mixture, but I'm saving those brightest highlights for my later layers. Now it's very easy to become overwhelmed when working with these different techniques. If we try to do this all at the same time, we're going to become quite confused with where we should be working. Now one way that I overcome that is by just focusing on one area at a time. So while I was waiting for the lighter layers on the right hand side to dry, I'm now adding some of those finer details to the wing. Once I've got that area nearer to completion, I can then work on something else, such as the beak there. It just enables me to focus on one or two small sections and not the entire painting, which can make us potentially rush because we're becoming stressed and overwhelmed. Now while I was waiting for the rest of the painting to dry, that's when I can work on the tail. So working it in these smaller manageable chunks can make it far easier for us to progress in that painting more effectively and efficiently. If we stop ourselves from becoming stressed, then we're going to paint so much better than if we try to get it all done at the same time. Now when aiming for a high level of photorealism in our paintings, it's really important to judge each section accordingly. So when I work with the tail, this area is quite small in relation to the size of the body. So I had to scale down my brush strokes. I didn't add as many details because I just didn't have the space. If I was to add the same number of details as I have to the body, then I'll actually make the feather on the tail look flatter and two-dimensional because I'm forcing detail that I just don't have space to add. So this is one of those times where less is more. The wing is another prime example. If I was to add the same number of brush strokes there than what I have on the body, that wing's going to look very fluffy, and that's not the right texture that that wing should have. And what's determined that is by adjusting how long the brush strokes are, how thick the brush strokes are, and those two things there are going to really change that texture. And this is exactly what I want no matter what it is that I'm painting. Now when it came to working on the fence post, the one thing that's going to be different about this layering process is that I don't blend the base layer as much as I did for the bird itself. So here I don't actually mind if some of my brush strokes are showing through on this base layer stage. That's going to help to build up the appearance of that rougher texture of the wood itself. So here, look, I'm jumping straight in to capturing more of those highlights and shadows without having to do a second blended layer. I'm allowing the roughness of those initial brush strokes, which I wouldn't normally like for painting fur or feathers, but I'm allowing that to work in my favour here. However, progressing forward, the layering process and the principles behind that are the same as when I worked on the bird. I want to be building up my values gradually. Now here I'm allowing more of my brush strokes to be visible, again making sure not to blend too much. If I do blend, I'm using another brush, not a makeup brush, and that's going to help to soften those edges. So there is still a degree of blending here, and this technique works really well with acrylics, not just for painting wood grain like this, but you can use the more individual wet on wet blending of those layers for fur or feathers. I feel like it's a more manageable way of blending acrylics, especially when working in smaller sections. So if you would like to see this technique explained thoroughly, then all of that, as I said, is mentioned in the real-time tutorial or any of my other acrylic tutorials on Patreon, because I use this technique in every single painting that I create. It's a really nice technique to use, and it's very versatile. It can create a range of different effects depending on how much you blend that out. Now something that is important is knowing what to paint first. So it doesn't matter the medium that we're working in. If we want to be working with building in that realism and that three-dimensional effect, then anything that's behind a subject should ideally be painted first. So that's why I painted the fence post initially, because the feet are sitting on top of that. If I was to paint the legs and the feet first, I'd had to have then painted around the toes, and you might have a bit of an effect of them being on the same layer. And of course you want to look like that toe is gripping above and on top of that wood. So that's why in this situation I'd always recommend to paint whatever a bird is perched on first, and then add the feet and the toes after. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I do have a list of all of the tutorials that are available on my Patreon listed on my website, so if you'd like to get an idea of what's available on Patreon, then I'll link my Patreon library in the description below. The wonderful thing with Patreon is it's very flexible, so you can stay for as long as you like or you can cancel at any time. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.